We were able to drive the Japanese fleet out of the Southern Ocean. I think we cost them about $100 million in total, and we saved 6,500 whales.
Welcome to the Our Hen House interview. This is Jasmine Singer.
This is Marianne Sullivan.
And we're so happy to welcome Sarah Levy, lawyer, scholar, and PhD candidate at the University of Oxford Center for Socio-Legal Studies, and Captain Paul Watson of course, the Captain Paul Watson Foundation, formerly of Greenpeace and the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, and no doubt known to you all for his lifelong work on behalf of the animals of the sea, and for truly his extraordinary TV show, Whale Wars. These two powerhouses are here to talk about their incredibly important and truly bold new book, The Only Flag Worth Flying: Direct Action and the Enforcement of International Marine Conservation Law. Welcome to our hen house, Sarah and Paul.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much for being here. And before we jump in, because we have so many questions for you, just a quick reminder to our listeners and our viewers about the Our Hen House podcasts. Rising Anxieties comes out on Tuesdays, The Hen Report on Thursdays, and the long form interview on Fridays. Bonus for Flock members comes out on Mondays. Don't forget that we're a podcast. We're on YouTube. Also, for those of you who prefer to watch your media, please hit subscribe and like wherever you listen. Now let's go to our incredible esteemed guests today. Sarah and Paul, the very title of your book reveals that this book is not merely reporting on what's happening. It's taking a very strong stand on the fact that we're facing a really desperate situation and desperate measures are called for. So, first of all, the only flag worth flying refers, of course, to the pirate flag, the Jolly Roger. And the subtitle specifically calls for direct action, challenging this idea that nation states will or even can enforce international law when it comes to the sea. So before we get to that, let's start with some facts. Can you just briefly tell us how dire the situation is? Like, what is happening to marine life?
Well, to me, the most difficult thing that we have to deal with is the diminishment of phytoplankton in the sea. So since 1950, there's been a 40% diminishment of all phytoplankton across the world's seas. Phytoplankton provides 70% of the oxygen we breathe, sequesters enormous amounts of CO2. This is a serious problem because if phytoplankton disappears from the ocean, we die. We do not live on this planet without phytoplankton. And why is phytoplankton being diminished? Because of the diminishment of whale populations, seabirds, fish populations, marine mammals. And why that is because these creatures provide the nutrients that are required by phytoplankton, primarily iron, magnesium, and nitrogen. So diminishment of that biomass causes a diminishment of probably the most essential group of plants on the planet, which is the phytoplankton. And unfortunately, most people are unaware of that.
Can you go into some of the situation of why the way you portray things out on the ocean, which is something that I guess is obvious, but really hadn't occurred to me. It's just the Wild West. Like there's kind of nobody in charge out there, right?
It is the Wild West. We have all the rules and the regulations to protect the ocean and life in the ocean, but there's a lack of enforcement. For instance, after 50 years, they finally got around last June to passing the High Seas Treaty on the protection of biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions. Great, but it's a piece of paper. It means nothing because it hasn't been enforced and nobody's enforcing it. And in fact, the only enforcement of any of these regulations has been by NGOs, primarily ours, to go out there and directly intervene, to physically intervene. And towards doing that, back in the 70s, I formulated a strategy which I call aggressive nonviolence, which is to aggressively intervene but without causing injury and to operate within the boundaries of the law and of practicality. And over all those years, we've been very successful, well, without being convicted of a single felony crime or losing a civil lawsuit. But we have shut down hundreds of illegal operations.
Before we get into all of that, and that's what we really want to talk about, I just want to go a little bit more into this legal situation, a little bit more into what the High Seas Treaty does, but also, I mean, most people listening, myself included, really don't know anything about all of the treaties. We just think there's things in place. can you go a little bit more into, maybe Sarah, you could do this like a really concise analysis of what the law is, how it works, and if they were the laws that if they were enforced, as Paul is talking about, what would they do?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about the high seas, it's certainly not incorrect to refer to it as the Wild West in terms of the law. I'd say up until very recently, with, as Paul talked about, the inception of the High Seas Treaty. But prior to that, we didn't really have any kind of major piece of legislation that was governing the high seas in terms of protecting biodiversity. We had a few ad hoc laws and treaties. For example, the International Whaling Commission had the moratorium on whaling, and certain sanctuaries and areas were protected. But of course, none of those laws, even those sort of bits and pieces that we used to have, were enforced, other than, as Paul has basically said, by the work of NGOs. But now we have the High Seas Treaty, which is, on its face, a fairly comprehensive piece of legislation that addresses this idea of the high seas being a global commons and does attempt to regulate it in some way. But it is, I think, a very ambitious piece of legislation, and what it will require is, much like, all of the other international treaties that we have, an enforcement mechanism. And so my wish with this, of course, is that it would put in place a framework for enforcement. But what I fear is that it might actually do the opposite and perhaps create a sense of closure from people who might think, okay, we've created the High Seas Treaty now, and that's the finish line. Because that can tend to happen sometimes with international laws where, we have a group of countries or the Conference of the Parties getting together, and there's a lot of patting on the back about something being created and then not really looking at how it's put into practice. So, I'm happy to get into some of the specific articles in the High Seas Treaty, because some of them do provide sort of mechanisms for further NGO participation, but there's also articles in the High Seas Treaty that kind of undermine the entire treaty itself. So it's comprehensive, but on the other hand side, complicated, like much of international law can be. So.
And speaking of which, we do want to hear about the specifics of that. We'll get to that in just a moment. But speaking of how complicated it is, Paul, something that has always struck me about your work is that you've often made this very point, that you are not violating the law or making up what you think should be the law, but actually enforcing the laws that are on the books, but being ignored. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We're not a protest organization. We intervene against illegal activities. For example, whaling has been illegal since 1986, and the Japanese, the Norwegians, and the Icelanders continue to do it. In 2014, we managed to get this into the International Court of Justice, and their ruling was that Japanese whaling was illegal. Yet it continued. So the problem is they just the countries that are involved just ignore the law. And the other problem with the High Seas Treaty is that it's been ratified by, the 60 countries at least that were required to ratify it, but only France and a few other larger countries, mostly they're smaller countries. Certainly the United States and other countries have not ratified it. And right now, the United States wants to go ahead with deep seabed mining, and which should be illegal, but they're just going to do it because they don't recognize the law.
Paul, tell us about the role of the World Charter for Nature in establishing the legal right to do what you do.
Well, I think Sarah could probably elaborate on that more, but it was passed in 1986 by the UN General Assembly. And do you want to elaborate on it, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. So the UN World Charter for Nature includes Article 21, which does actually grant private actors, civil society, the ability to intervene to protect global commons and areas that are at risk. Although the provision itself does, when you read it on its face, seem to grant this authority, though, the issue is that the UN World Charter for Nature is not considered binding. So it does, in some way, create a customary law, but this is not a treaty that many nations, have ratified or considered binding, but the argument that, I make in the book is that it does establish a norm for non-state actors to intervene in this way, and not only it establishes it, but in some way calls for it as well. So
And even when countries where it is binded, well, for instance, in 1995, I chased the Spanish drag trawlers out the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. I was arrested by the Canadian government, charged with 3 counts of mischief. My defense was the UN World Charter for Nature. Well, Canada brought a law professor from Toronto that said it had no application under Canadian law. And the judge says, but didn't Canada sign this? And she says, yeah, but Canada signs a lot of things. So basically, he advised the jury to take it into consideration, and I was acquitted of the charges.
Yeah, I'm really sorry for laughing, but God, sometimes you just really have to. But I think, I mean, I just wanted to take a moment to clarify for people why this book is so extraordinarily important. I mean, I was saying this to Paul before we started recording, that I think this book is absolutely vital because it sounds so far that we're just talking about, we're going to sort out what all the laws are and talk about a few adventures. That's not what this book is about. This book is about how we have to change the way we look at the law of the sea, and most significantly, how it is enforced or whether it's enforced. And these are very new, very radical ideas that are desperately needed. And one of the things, obviously, that you do is challenge the assumption that only nation states have the authority to enforce laws, which is a pretty radical assumption. But it kind of begs the question of who else has the authority. I mean, like where does that authority come from? So what are the elements that might provide legitimacy to a non-governmental entity like the Paul Watson Foundation that claims to be enforcing the law, and other people think they're not, and that's basically the conflict that I think has been the basis of Paul's work his whole life in some ways. And you're really trying to get it down onto paper, like what's going on here. Is that right? And so where does that legitimacy come from?
the concept of legitimacy in the book is treated as sort of an outcomes-based legitimacy, not legitimacy that comes through, let's say, having authority granted formally, like to a nation state. But the way that I conceive of legitimacy in looking at this issue of high seas enforcement is who is the most effective actor. And what I establish in chapter 3, especially looking at the history of international environmental law, is that nation states have been successful at creating frameworks and creating norms, but they have consistently failed to enforce them. And that there's really only one actor, which is non-state actors, and at that, a very small group of those non-state actors who have been successful at effectively enforcing these laws, and doing so in a number of ways, at times actually working at the behest of the state, sometimes working alongside Interpol, but yes, sometimes working independently. And I think the reason I came to, this whole idea in the first place was just due to a general frustration that groups like Sea Shepherd were always being derided as vigilantes and sometimes even eco-terrorists, because it's so not the role that they occupy from a legal perspective when you look at the fact that they're have consistently worked within the law and always actually been the ones who are upholding law against illegal actors rather than being the illegal actors themselves. So yeah, it's a really interesting question, but, I also take your point of, what kind of door does this open for, other non-state actors? And if we're going to sort of say that, certain groups are allowed to enforce laws, then, where do we draw the line? And this is certainly something that might need to be negotiated at some point. But this is where, I also, take groups like Sea Shepherd and Captain Paul Watson Foundation as always having, a high standard of accountability and not seeing that it's just a matter of being effective, but also still operating within legal norms, being accountable, and as Paul mentioned, very clearly having the strategy of aggressive nonviolence and not tipping into that violent space as some actual eco-terrorist groups have done. But that is certainly, not the category of activism in which I would place groups like Sea Shepherd and the Paul Watson Foundation. So,
as an example, in 1986, we sank half of Iceland's whaling fleet, destroyed their whale processing plant, shut down their operations. On the surface, that might sound quite illegal, but they refused to charge me. A year after this happened, I flew to Iceland to demand that I be arrested. And they asked me when I arrived at the airport, how long do you intend to stay? I said, I don't know, 5 days, 5 minutes, 5 years, you tell me. And we went to interrogation and they said, are you admitting to sinking these ships? I said, yep, and we're going to sink the other two at the first opportunity. Well, they drove me to the airport, they put me on a plane, told me to go home. And the Minister of Justice in Parliament that morning said, who does he think he is? He comes into our country and demands to be arrested. Get him out of here. And the reason being is they knew, and I knew before this, that if they put me on trial in Iceland, they would be putting themselves on trial for breaking the moratorium on commercial whaling.
Fascinating. But so, Paul, you alluded to this before, but can you define what you mean by direct action and give us some examples and explain how it differs from other types of resistance?
Well, it's direct intervention, really. You see an illegal activity and you go in and you interfere with your ability to carry out that illegal activity. We were able to, drive the Japanese fleet out of the Southern Ocean. We cost them I think we cost them about $100 million in total, and we saved 6,500 whales. And that was through constant harassment, blocking their ability to whale. And we didn't hurt anybody. There was damage, but that was primarily because they were ramming into us and causing all kinds of problems that way. But we had to be prepared for that. But I think that in order to do this thing, you have to be prepared to take it to the next level, which is to go into the courts and hopefully set a precedent in this way. And every time I've gone into the court cases, it's been difficult. And of course, the wheels of the law move really slow, but we've always won. Example, we shut down a tuna fishing operation in the Mediterranean off the coast of Libya. I cut the nets and I released 900 tuna that were caught illegally. And a year later, my ship was arrested in Scotland, and it was a civil case. They said that I had stolen their property. I said, but the property was these fish were caught illegally, and the British government or the court said, well, it doesn't matter, it's still their property. And so we had to go to trial, and we won the trial, we won the case, but they had a lot of money, so they took us to the Court of Appeals, and they won at the Court of Appeals. And then we carried on and we went to the Supreme Court and we won, and they had to pay us £1.5 million in damages. So it's a long process, but we, by operating within the law, we can use the law to our advantage.
Yeah, it's a very high stakes business, I have to say.
Yeah.
All right, so there's three areas. I mean, getting back to what you were talking about, Sarah, like kind of creating this framework for when this works and when it doesn't. You identify these three areas where I think, correct me if I'm wrong, where it can be justified, where the state lacks the means to enforce it, where the state lacks the political will to enforce it. I bet we have a lot of that. Or the state lacks jurisdiction. And then a big part of the book are these three major case studies to illustrate this work. I mean, you've told some stories, Paul, but and I know you can't tell us these full stories, and people would have to read the book. But can you touch on these campaigns and tell us how they illustrate these areas where intervention is? You can say, well, it's appropriate here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can all agree and recognize that there's an enforcement vacuum. And there are so many examples of this, so many case studies that can illustrate this. But as you noted, the case studies that I chose, I tried to choose a case study that was in some way illustrating a specific reason why there was an enforcement gap and then why a non-state actor had been successful in filling it. And so sometimes it's a matter of lacking means and lacking capacity, as discussed in the example of Operation Sharkwater, wherein Sea Shepherd intervened on behalf of Guatemala, basically to interfere with illegal shark finning operations that were occurring from Costa Rican vessels within their territorial waters. And in this case, it was to some degree a lack of means, lack of resources on the part of the government to combat this. But, there's also an element to some degree of nation states not wanting to get involved in conflict. And so then hiring groups like Sea Shepherd, at the time to get involved on their behalf. And, in this way, sort of the groups function as privateers rather than pirates. So that's one example. But then, one of the clearest examples where there's been a lack of political will to enforce the laws that we have has been with whaling in the Southern Ocean. And I identified that as kind of Operation Relentless, but, I'm sure Paul can, say much more about this, but Sea Shepherd and now Captain Paul Watson Foundation have had so many operations to combat this issue over the years. But Really, it's been largely because there's been, although a very clear law that states that it is illegal to whale in the Southern Ocean, there's been a lack of political will on the part of nation states to go to the Southern Ocean and interfere with Japan's illegal whaling operations. So that's, yeah, in some way not just one case, but a very ongoing issue.
And that's the stories that were told in Whale Wars, right? For people. When was Whale Wars? I mean, it was a while back. The older I get, the faster everything seems to
2007
go.
to
Oh wow.
2016.
It, yeah, like if people, I'm sure it's still on YouTube or somewhere. So if people haven't watched it, like set aside a week or two.
One slight correction, Sarah, is that we've never actually been hired by anybody. No, countries don't hire us. We come to an agreement, but we have to foot the bill.
Yeah.
You know, uh,
Yeah, it's
we
an
had
important distinction that the resources are not provided, but just, yeah, rather the authority, the jurisdiction.
Right.
So
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, I know. I'm glad you clarified that because I was
Yeah.
curious.
right now we have two campaigns going. We have a ship in the waters of French Guiana, and we were invited there by two very unusual groups: the government of France and the fishermen in French Guiana. And why they invited us there was because of they can't deal with the poachers that are operating in their waters. So
No.
we went out there with our larger vessel. We've been confiscating poaching nets every day, and we're doing that in cooperation with both the government and with the fishermen. Our other campaign is set to leave next week, and that actually this Thursday in a couple of days, and that is to cross the Southern Ocean from Australia to confront the Norwegian krill fishery, which is at the southern tip of South America. This is an extremely destructive industry, and it's actually technically legal. But last year they took 625,000 metric tons from the ocean. This year they want to take 1.2 million metric tons. This is the primary food for the whales, the penguins, the fishes, the seabirds, and there really is no studies as to what kind of impact that's having on those populations. So it's a very crucial thing, and really, the law really hasn't had time to catch up with what they're actually doing. So
Mm.
our intention there is to go there and interfere with their operation. Now, hopefully, they will lay charges against us, and civil charges. And if they do, then that's our opportunity to get this thing challenged in a court. Now, it's interesting. 10 days ago, I received a letter from Acker Grill. It's called. It's a fish. A zooplankton exploitation company. It's a
Okay.
most unusual letter. They said, we will give you a ship. You can come down here and come with us, and we can show you the transparency of our operation. We'll give you all you need to do it. You can talk to our scientists. And my response to that was, your scientists work for you. They're basically prostitutes. So, they're going to defend whatever you do, no matter what. And I said, no, thank you. We will go down there and see for ourselves. But we're not only going to see for ourselves, we're going to interfere with your activities in order to protect that marine ecosystem. So the very fact that they sent this letter indicates to me that they're quite worried that we're coming.
Yeah. No,
Yes.
it's definitely sounds like taking a chance at trying to co-opt you,
Mm.
rather than rather than actually prove that they're doing the right thing. Is that a situation? We had mentioned that there are three areas that you focused on where the state lacks the means, which you've covered, and the state lacks the political will, which, I guess those kind of overlap a little bit. But
Absolutely. Yeah.
is this where the krill are involved? Is that where the state lacks jurisdiction? I mean, who has jurisdiction over those waters? Which I guess is a bigger question. Who has jurisdiction over most of the waters?
There is an organization that has jurisdiction, but they pretty much rubber stamp whatever the industry wants, in
Okay.
my opinion.
Sarah, what were your examples in the book of a situation where the where nobody has jurisdiction, or whoever has jurisdiction is not acting?
Yeah, so in that case, I used Operation Icefish as the main case study, and that was when we're talking about the illegal toothfish poachers. And that's again an area beyond national jurisdiction, high seas, there's, well without of territorial waters, and that resulted in the longest sea chase in maritime history, as far as I'm concerned, where Sea Shepherd, who was working basically on behalf of Interpol, was chasing the Thunder and several other illegal toothfish poaching vessels. And this was actually an intervention that was very effective because it was basically over and done within 110 days, whereas Interpol had been trying to catch these vessels for around a decade. And so
Wow.
this was, again, a really good example of where Sea Shepherd as a non-state actor was so much more effective than a very well-established international organization. So,
Something something very strange about that incident is we were working with Interpol, and I'm the only person in the history of Interpol to be working with them and also being on their Interpol red notice that they were trying to arrest me at the same time.
That's so funny. Does this book or this manifesto really advocate for more than the right to enforce the law that is on the books? Like what I'm saying is, what if there isn't a law, even a toothless one? You talk about the right to non-state marine conservation, but what does that mean?
yeah, so the scope of the book is looking at non-state actors as enforcing laws that already do exist. It's not really going beyond that because the main purpose of the book is to look at how non-state actors have filled that enforcement vacuum, not in some way taken matters of protecting our oceans into their hands. I think that's, yeah, a really interesting topic and one that I talk about a little bit towards the conclusion and just discussing, who speaks for the ocean and who is really set to be the group, the actor that is setting the standards for protecting our oceans. So I think in some way it's a bigger philosophical question, but yeah, not really what the book deals with specifically. So
I can't help but ask them these questions, though. Sorry.
yeah,
Because one
absolutely.
does wonder what's next. But another thing I really wanted to ask about is the story of your recent detention poll. I definitely remember when this was happening. I think everybody in the movement was really nervous that this was it. Like we were going to lose you. Can you just tell folks that story?
Well, I've been on the Interpol red notice for since 2012. So the Japanese have been chasing me for 14 years. So unsuccessfully, I escaped from Germany the first time they had me arrested. Then when I was arrested in July of 24 in Greenland, it was because Denmark is killing pilot whales and dolphins, and therefore Japan teamed up with them to have me arrested. It was a big deal, but I saw it as an opportunity. It was an opportunity to turn this whole thing into a campaign to focus international attention, not just on Japan's continued illegal operations, but also on the killing of pilot whales and dolphins in the Danish Faroe Islands. So to me, it was a big campaign, and it was highly successful as a campaign. And so I thought it was one of our most successful campaigns overall, really. And also the publicity from all of that, the backlash of all of that ended up with Interpol dismissing the red notice against me and stating very clearly that it was politically motivated, which has got Japan is absolutely furious about. But this whole thing, I mean, the red notice is for war criminals and major drug traffickers and serial killers. I'm the only person in the history of Interpol to be on there for obstructing conspiracy to obstruct business and conspiracy to trespass. Those are the charges. And Japan wants to give me 15 years in prison on that, which is ridiculous. It's all very politically motivated. But it has turned into a device that we can use to further embarrass the Japanese whaling industry.
Well, that's a positive.
Sarah, you make the point that the work is grounded in what you call bio and ecocentric legal theory rather than anthropocentric law, and refer to the role of indigenous governance. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so it's more when, discussing why we have international environmental laws to begin with, I sort of lay the ethical framework for that and talking about the difference between an anthropocentric ethic, which puts humans at the top and then basically animals and nature below. It's very hierarchical in some way. And then that there are also bio and ecocentric ethical frameworks, biocentric frameworks, which value the really intrinsic value of all life, and then ecocentric ethics, which see environments and ecosystems as being all intrinsically linked, and really every piece of that, whether it's an animal or a tree, is having an important and distinct role and thus having value. And really looking at how those kind of ethics can be used to frame in some way and inform new approaches to law, and how they have also to a certain degree been the basis of the creation of some of the international environmental laws that we have. But of course, bio and ecocentric ethics are nothing new in terms of many indigenous ways of being, spiritualities, and also ways of relating and managing environments and ecosystems. And so, in terms of this role, not only of Indigenous ways of thinking, but also Indigenous marine governance, that's dealt with in chapter 7 of the book, where I go on to really talk, not only about non-state actors and NGOs, but also about other groups that are really in some way replacing the role and the significance of the nation state. And so, I identify Indigenous actors as becoming very prevalent in this space, and then as well, private corporations and other NGOs is stepping into that gap as well. But, I think there's a particular role, and we're seeing Indigenous groups in many different spheres that have managed and continue to manage certain marine areas in a way that's very responsible, and in a way that is now in some way being attempts to be replicated by the nation state to some degree. And, we see this with the incorporation of traditional knowledge, for example, being used almost as if it's something novel, whereas this is, biocentric and ecocentric ways of being have, been there for a very long time. So we're just more seeing, I think, more of an acknowledgement of that now.
Yeah, I think that's very exciting. And I know you just said that you don't want to go beyond the acknowledged scope of the book, but we are sort of I mean, it's clear that you're thinking about where could things go, even though maybe we don't know at this point. Is the big challenge here, like we talked about vigilantism and how Paul's work has always been accused of that. Is the big effort to draw that line between something that is organized, something that is institutional, to govern the oceans without going into vigilantism, but really being able to create a system where direct action by individuals or individual organizations is possible because nobody else is going to do it. All right, this question has gone off the deep end. I know it doesn't make a lot of sense, but I'm trying to think about, like, where is the future here? Like, or what's a possible future that we can have law, but it can also be enforced, even though, nation states don't seem to want to enforce it and really frequently don't have the ability to enforce it. But it's not all just, I mean, Paul is one of the people that we can trust to try to do the right thing, but I'm sure there's many pirates out there who are not the good pirates.
Well, a biocentric problem cannot be solved through from an anthropocentric approach. And that is why after 30 climate change conferences and numerous environmental conferences, nothing has been accomplished from any of those, because they're trying to solve problems through the traditional application of anthropocentric values and everything. Good example, yesterday I was in a 3-hour meeting on trying to decide what to do with the orcas in Antibes in southern France, because and they said that it's an impossible solution. And I was trying to present a solution to the Minister of Ecological Transition. And he said, well, we've only got 6 months. Now you come to us and I said, we were here 3.5 years ago doing the same talks. We were here 2 years ago. We were here 1 year ago. And you know what he did? Another meeting next month. That's all it ever is. See, politicians cannot solve problems. It's political suicide. If they make it, they're afraid to make decisions. They don't have the courage. They don't have the passion. They don't even have the imagination to solve these problems. So almost everything that is being done done by grassroots organizations and very motivating individuals. And that, I mean, it's because of Diane Fossey, we got mountain gorillas. They didn't go extinct. Look what James Bill's done. Look at all these people that have done all of the great achievements that come from passionate, courageous individuals.
This is probably silly, but it's really reminded me of what's going on in so many different ways. And with the news environment, like, we used to rely on big institutional providers of the news, and it turned out like it didn't work, and they're falling apart. But there's all of these individuals jumping up, trying to like cover what's going on and tell people what's happening. And I don't really think this is a problem that's similar to that, in the sense that it really, as you point out, it really, requires the passionate people who are not necessarily in charge of everything to be doing the work, But then this is why this book is so important, because drawing that line between allowing those people to have the role and yet not having it, and having enough of a structure to make sure that it's the good people jumping up and doing the work, and that there's some structure in which these people can act is so important. I know you haven't answered all the questions, Sarah, but I really appreciate how you have really started to ask them. This is important in so many different aspects of society. All right, I'm not really sure where to go from there, because I do have this question that kind of goes back into the mundane, but I'm just curious, and it does have a lot to do with how much individuals or individual organizations can be effective. And that's technology. Is all of this possible now because of the growth of certain kinds of technology that make it easier for non-state actors as opposed to governments to be effective?
Yeah, and that's something that's touched on in chapter 7, which is really speaking in some way to what you're asking, Marianne, about where do we go from here. And I think that not only with the increasing prevalence of indigenous groups and non-state actors and corporations, but also with the rise of technology as a tool that is accessible to all of these non-state actors, it's just very much the direction that we're heading in now, that the state is becoming increasingly less relevant, because they are not only sometimes they have the same capabilities, but just very often lacking the will to act. Whereas with these tools that allow non-state groups, whoever they may be, to act, they will, I think, very quickly and already are outpacing the nation state in many of these regards. So it's yeah, something that I think is an incredible opportunity, but also, specifically from that perspective, something that I can see going off the rails if it's not, of course, regulated. And, it's in some way, as we see with AI, just something that is growing in many ways and evolving at a rate that, we cannot keep up with. And that is specifically going to be an issue of, what hands does that technology fall into and who's using it, how are they using it? But the outcome from my perspective is going to be the same, in that, governments are just not really going to be the main actor on this stage going forward. So,
Paul, you say something along the lines that, in spite of what you know and what you've seen, not only have you enjoyed every moment of your adventures, but you're not pessimistic. How do you pull that off? I'm asking for a friend.
Many years ago, I learned a very, very valuable lesson. I was a volunteer medic at Wounded Knee during the occupation in 1973, and we were surrounded by federal troops who were shooting at us. They wounded 46, they killed 2. I went to Russell Means, who was the leader of the American Indian movement, and I said, look, we don't have any hope of winning here. The odds are against us. We cannot win. So why are we continuing? And he told me something that stayed with me for the rest of my life. And he said, well, we're not concerned about winning or losing. We're not here because we're going to win. We're here because this is the right place to be, the right time to do it, the right thing to do. He said, don't worry about the future. You don't have any power over the future, but you have absolute power over the present. And it's what we do in the present that will define the future. So I don't get pessimistic. I don't get, depressed, because all I can do is what I can do in the present. And how the future unfolds, that's out of my control.
I just think that's such an important message for this moment in the world, and especially in the United States. And we're in such a crisis, and we're all like panicked about what we can do to change it, and we can't do anything to change it. It feels like, but I mean, that has always been the case with the seas, and look at how much that you have accomplished. Do you see this story of what's going on with the oceans fit into the story of what people, here anyway, are calling the Epstein class, this sordid story of the billionaires who want to run the world and the disempowerment?
It's not that they want to run the world. They do run the world, and they're
Yeah.
manipulating it every day. They control all of the finances. I mean, that's the reason the fish are being destroyed in the ocean. That's the reason all of the forests are being shut down. There is no media to challenge them. There are no politicians to challenge them. The only challenge is coming from people on the ground who are sitting in trees or handcuffing themselves to
Yeah.
bulldozers.
yeah, and I think
Right.
it's really easy to feel disempowered by all of this and succumb to a sort of nihilism. And I see that a lot with my generation, just, a sense of hopelessness, climate anxiety, for example, just becoming, a really paralyzing phenomenon that we're seeing. But, I couldn't agree more, with Paul's sentiment about the fact that, we're acting because this is the right place and time to do it, and we can't be focused on whether or not it's going to solve these massive global problems. And yeah, it reminds me a lot of something that my supervisor, who was the person who really encouraged me with this master's thesis that's now taking the form of this book, had in his office. A few years ago, he had a sign in his office that said, "We've got to take care of the small things because the big things are all fucked up." And I just, have really taken that as, yeah, in some way a very kind of guiding sentiment, in the same spirit as Paul's story, that, you have to still do what you can, even if you can't fix everything.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to what you were saying about Russell Means, I think is sort of like, what else is your life about? I mean, like you're just going to go along with it, or are you going to fight it? And nobody has done that better than you, Paul. Actually, Paul, you're kind of an inspiration because you've had so much success. I mean, I think there are a lot of people out there maybe fighting the fight who haven't pulled it off as much as you have in your life, which is a tribute to your skills and your boldness, and maybe also a little bit of luck. I don't know.
All my life, everybody says, you're going to get yourself killed. You're going to get your crew killed. You're totally irresponsible. I said, well, God, I'm 75 now. I'm still here. I haven't lost a crew member, and I've never injured anybody. So aggressive nonviolence is a strategy that works. It's successful.
So I'm just going to note, I'm also 75. Are you a child of the 1950?
I was born in 1950.
Yeah, me too. I always feel a unity with people born the same year as me. Uh, all right. So before we go, let's get into the real world and tell us about your current work. You've talked about it a bit, particularly the Krill campaign. But tell us about the Captain Paul Watson Foundation, what you're doing, and how people can find out more and support it.
Well, 3 years ago, we had a hostile takeover of Sea Shepherd, which I had put together because of whale wars, it was bringing in quite a bit of money. And now we got people who I knew for 20 years who decided that I was too controversial and too confrontational, and it was a threat to the big donors. So they dismissed me. They actually offered me $300,000 a year to do nothing, say nothing, write nothing. I said, just be a figurehead. I said, I'm not going to do that. And so they dismissed me, and I had to start all over again. God, now we have those shifts. But I also did a partnership with Sea Shepherd France, Sea Shepherd Brazil, and the UK that did not go along with those the
Okay.
people who took over. So we're just carrying on the movement, really. And it was my fault. I should not have trusted the people I did. Unfortunately, that's been one of my big weaknesses over the years, trusting people without taking the proper precautions. But anyway, it also leads me to this understanding that, change comes through small organizations. And the bigger you get, the less successful you are. So Greenpeace, the organization that I co-founded, now brings in 365 million euros a year, has a staff of 3,000. And I can tell you right now, we did more in the 70s with a very small fraction of that. So it's not the money that makes the organization, it's the passion, it's the courage, it's the imagination of the individuals who are involved in it.
In addition to the Krill campaign, can you talk about the other? I guess you've alluded to a few things, but just tell us about the campaigns.
Well, I have ongoing campaigns against the killing of whales and dolphins in the Faroe Islands. We're watching Iceland very closely. We're protecting turtles in Mayotte, an island between Mozambique and Madagascar. Manatees and dolphins in the Amazon, trying to do a river patrol in the Xingu and Mato Grosso, protecting orcas off of Iberia. So there's numerous campaigns that we're doing, and we're doing it in partnership with other organizations, not with just Sea Shepherd, working with the Bob Brown Foundation in Tasmania to try and protect, the oceans there, because they're supporting our krill campaign. So, the strength of an ecosystem is in diversity. Therefore, the strength of a movement must be in diversity. And that means we encourage that all approaches, education, litigation, legislation, activism, it all has to work together towards us, because none of us can do it by ourselves.
So, Sarah, tell us about your current. You're working towards your PhD, I think. And do we get to ask you what you're writing about, or is it a big secret?
No, it's no secret. Yeah, so my PhD project is still focusing on, issues around marine mammal legislation, but turning away from international law and focusing specifically on seal hunting in Canada. I am Canadian. Yeah, I'm from Winnipeg, so from the prairies. But yeah, I studied and worked in Toronto for several years. But yeah, my project, concerns seal hunting, which occurs in the East Coast in Canada in the form of the commercial, mass seal slaughter, and then also occurs throughout the Arctic in Canada, taken on by Inuit sealers. So, big part of my project is exploring the differences between these two hunting practices because in Canada, there's really been a very deliberate project of conflating those two practices, basically on the part of the Canadian government as a means of sheltering the commercial seal hunt from criticism. But then the legal aspect of my PhD is looking at the EU ban on seal products and basically, that as a legal mechanism and also how it in many ways has failed to distinguish between commercial sealing and Inuit sealing, what the ramifications of that have been. So, in many ways, the project is both an Indigenous and animal rights topic at once. So
Yeah, that sounds fascinating, and so important because obviously, if one jurisdiction like the EU is willing to take a step against something that is being done because it's making people a lot of money, that's kind of the name of the game. All right, so I think that I think that we should go to bonus because there's a few really personal questions I want to ask you. But before we go, I just want to mention I'm so grateful that The Only Flag Worth Flying has been published. I really do. I'm not just saying it. I think this is a really important book. But it is fairly
Thank you.
academic, and I know people are going to want to read it, and it's readable, but it's fairly academic. So aside from considering buying it, please also recommend that your library purchase it, particularly if you have any affiliation with an academic or a law library. I just think it's really important for this book to get out there. And of course, at your public library as well, but particularly law libraries. This should be in every law library. So please do that.
Yeah, I'm also I wanted to echo that I'm super excited that this book exists, and I definitely think our listeners should get yourself a copy or two. And how can people follow your work and support your efforts?
Just something about the book and its academic content versus, the content that may be a little bit more interesting for the everyday reader. I just, if anyone's interested in purchasing the book, just wanted to mention that chapters 2 and 3 of the book are really where the dense kind of legal framework and history is outlined. But beyond that, chapters 4, which really goes through the tactics that groups like Sea Shepherd have used, and then the case studies and the future of ocean governance, and really looking a lot at what happened in terms of Paul's detention in Greenland, are not as academically in nature. But yeah, in that regard, there's kind of something for everyone throughout the book.
Thank you for pointing that out, because that's really true. Because actually that happened to me as I started reading it. I think it was chapter 2, which goes into the background of international. And I am a lawyer, but it was a little.
It's very foundational.
Dense, and I thought that the whole book was going to be that dense, and then I was like, then it got into a kind of a novel. So.
Yeah, certainly. And in terms of following my work, you can follow that through my academic website. If you search my name, I come up on the Oxford website, and the things I'm currently working on and publications come up on there, and as well on LinkedIn. But yeah, I'm not on X or Instagram really, or anything like that. So those are the two best ways to keep up with what's going on. So yeah.
And Paul, what's the best way for people? What link do you want people to connect you with, since there's so many?
Well, we have websites and the various social networks. Just look up the Captain Paul Watson Foundation or Sea Shepherd France, or whatever.
We'll put it all in the show notes as well. And I know you two are sticking on for a few minutes for our bonus content. So if you're listening or watching this and you're a Flock member, lucky you. And if you're not yet a Flock member and you feel like joining us, check it out at ourhenhouse.org/support. It is one way that you can get access to bonus content, such as the interview that we're about to do with Sarah and Paul. And thank you to those of you who already are. Thank you also for tuning in, and be sure to share this episode on all your socials. We will talk to you next week.